Good evening, BookTube. So, tonight rather, will be my review of Washington Square by Henry James. Excuse me. So, recently I've been watching a lot of historical romance-related book reviews on BookTube, and I thought, have I read anything like that? So, stuff written by authors like Julia Quinn, who famously wrote the Bridgerton series, and guilty pleasure, guilty as charged. I watched that show on Netflix. I like the colorful costumes, but moving on, and other such authors who write that. So they have those cheesy step-back covers with those muscle-bound men with the flowing hair and them embracing a woman. It's beautiful artwork, I must say. But it is to some extent what Ollie from Criminoli would call trash. Excuse me. Now, so I thought, and also anything written by Jane Austen. I had to actually study Jane Austen in school, but part of a school reading assignment that I was given one time was Washington Square by Henry James. So this book is the closest book that I've read in completion that resembles anything like Jane Austen, or, excuse the motorcycle, anything like Jane Austen, or anything like the contemporary historical romances that we see in circulation around the internet. Anyway, but what's interesting about this book is it was written by a man, and this is an anti-romance. So it's a tragedy/comedy, this book. This book is from the perspective of the spinster and her failed romance, attempt at romance, failed engagement. Now, that's the thing though. I wouldn't recommend this book. I'm not going to rate it, and I don't recommend it for various reasons, which I'll get to shortly. But from the outset, I'll say that this book is wasted potential, because there's so many problems with it, but writing an anti-romance could have worked had it only done a few small tweaks to this story. So basically, Henry James, this book was published in, when was this? 1881. But this story takes place in the 1850s, I believe. It says 1850s on the blurb here. Anyway, so this was written in 1881, and like I said, it's wasted potential, because I can actually see myself laughing at this. I can see myself relating to this book, but there's just so many problems. Let's get to the plot to get that out of the way, so then I can highlight the issues with this book. And by the way, I'm gonna spoiler alert for the ending, only because I really don't recommend this book. So please step away from the video now if you plan on reading Washington Square in the foreseeable future, or if you just don't care. Now, oh God, that's one of the problems with making these unedited YouTube videos. You'll always see me clearing my throat. I'm like that in real life. Anyway, where was I? Yes, the plot. So, a Dr. Sloper, who is a 19th century doctor, is relatively wealthy. his wife has passed away, and he has only one child, an only daughter called Catherine. Now, Dr. Sloper is relatively wealthy, so Catherine seeks to inherit a reasonable fortune, okay? A reasonable fortune. But a man named Morris Townsend comes into her life and woos Catherine. And I think because he's a gambler, or Dr. Sloper smells a rat, a fortune hunter, he threatens, he says, he tells his daughter Catherine to cut off the engagement with Morris Townsend because he's no good for her. He just wants the family money. But she insists and says, "I'm in love with this man, I want to marry him." And he says, "If you do, I will cut your inheritance." And as the story progresses, there are Morris Townsend, how do I put this? Morris Townsend makes excuses and delays the wedding date further and further, hoping that Dr. Sloper that his potential father-in-law will relent and still give Catherine the money. So he keeps making excuses to delay the wedding, and of course, eventually, Morris Townsend ends the engagement with Catherine. I'm writing that novel. I'm writing that slasher novel one day. You'll find out what I'm talking about sometime later this year. Anyway, yeah, I think if I try to be as casual and unscripted as possible, I think this video will flow more naturally. I will look less stiff. Anyway, so eventually Morris Townsend cuts off his engagement to Catherine, but her father refuses to forgive his daughter. So Dr. Sloper refuses to forgive his daughter Catherine for the engagement to this fortune hunter, and she ends up a spinster with a greatly reduced inheritance. So like he cut her inheritance by, I don't know, 50% or something, because he's afraid that Mr. Townsend will come back into her life. So, and meanwhile, a subplot to all of this, Dr. Sloper's sister, Mrs. Penniman, Dr. Sloper's sister, likes Morris Townsend, and she indulges him like he were her own son. She invites him over to her house all the time, tries to arrange get-togethers with Catherine. She has this fixation with the melodramatic. So so I think she's just an interloper, a meddler, and that's such an annoying character. She doesn't make it easy on her brother and on her niece to cut off relations with this scoundrel. So throughout this book, I thought, God, you're meddling. But that was potential for like a funny subplot, I must admit. Now, there are two problems with this book. So Henry James celebrates mediocrity. Even the title itself doesn't say anything. It's just Washington Square, the address, the location of where most of this drama takes place. And on top of that, he writes these really, really, really long sentences without really saying anything. He's just like middle ground, middle ground. And so Catherine is described as sweet and a bit of a plain Jane. She's not pretty, but not necessarily ugly either. Dr. Sloper is wealthy, but upon recent years, he's suffered some setbacks in his finances. And he just goes on and on and on with mediocrity after mediocrity. Just meh, 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 meh. And he writes all these really, really long sentences with barely telling you anything. I'll give you the first sentence to this book. Well, not the complete sentence, just to show you what I'm talking about. I'll read out the part where I'm seeing, see, this is what I'm talking about. You'll get a lot of this in the book. Hang on. During a portion of the first half of the present century, and more particularly during the latter part of it, and then there's a comma, and then the sentence goes on. See? You'll get a lot of that. So, is it the first half or the latter half? He just goes on and on and on without really saying anything. And the next part is the ending. Catherine ends up alone without a man with a reduced fortune. If the ending were rewritten, this book has a lot of potential. This book needs a retelling. If there is any author out there, don't make me write it, please. I'm not American, and I'm not a romance writer. Don't make me do the retelling. But if anyone can find the Henry James estate and say, can we do a retelling of Washington Square? That would be awesome, you know? So this is like this is a bad example of why you should bad example of writing an anti-romance. So all those happily ever afters, all those silly balls and all those silly romances, and complex interhuman interactions that Jane Austen writes about, or those really fluffy romances Julia Quinn writes. If you try to write the opposite of it, this is a bad example of what might happen. But this book is salvageable in two ways. If it was rewritten, if the author didn't write it in such a bland and boring way, and if the ending were rewritten. So here's some potential ways to rewrite the ending. She doesn't end up with Morris Townsend. She doesn't end up with a man. Fair enough, fair enough. But she still gets the inheritance. She still has a happily ever after being financially stable. She might have had an out of wedlock sexual encounter and got pregnant. And I know. This book was written in the 19th century. People would have been pressured into getting married if they did that. I get that. But this is, so that's why we could do a contemporary modern day remake of this story. She could have found love in becoming a mom, a mother, a mum. She could have found happiness in becoming, I don't know, a nun, entering a monastery. She could have, like I said earlier, she could have gotten her inheritance and lived the rest of her life relatively wealthy. Or here's a twist. She could have found happiness with another woman. Why not? Why not? So if we had just rewritten the ending, and if Henry James wasn't such a boring author, this story would have had potential. So, that is my review. I'm not going to rate this book, and I don't recommend you read this book, and I've already spoiled the entire thing at this point. But, someone has to do the anti-romance trope and do not trope, Someone has to do the anti-romance and do it better than Henry James did. And the reason why I'm reviewing this book is I read this book in its entirety when I was in school, and I had to write and I had to answer questions about it. I had to make my own school review about it. So we did like a study on it in school. I didn't appreciate that class assignment, but nevertheless, the book stuck with me all these years. I remember the story. And there you go. There you go. The book has potential, wasted potential, but that's all I have to say for now.